Okay, good morning, everybody. It is 9 o'clock, so I think we're going to get started. Thank you for joining us for this month's Brunch and Learn. My name is Alexis Baxley. I'm the Executive Director at the North Dakota School Boards Association. As you can probably tell, or as you know, because you're here, this morning's session, we're going to talk about the recently adjourned 68th Legislative Assembly and the upcoming interim. I'm going to do my best to cover as many of the bills and issues as possible, but it will be impossible to cover all of them in 1 hour. So please feel free to ask questions or reach out afterwards if I miss something or don't go into as much detail as you're looking for on a particular topic, excuse me. So to ask a question, please make sure to either use the raise your hand feature and we'll unmute you, or enter your question in the Q&A box. I'm not going to monitor the chat super closely, so if you do enter your question there, there's a chance that we could miss it. If you raise your hand during the discussion, but we do answer your question before we get to you, somebody else asks the same question, just go ahead and click the raise your hand icon again to lower your hand so that we don't call on you twice. And then if, like I said, we don't cover something that you want to talk about, I do have a hard stop at 10 o'clock today. I have plenty of time later. I'd happily take phone calls or emails to chat about other specific issues that you'd like to chat about that we don't get to cover today. So please always feel comfortable to reach out and talk about those things. So we'll be recording today's webinar and posting it to the NDSBA website under resources. And we are, of course, live streaming to our YouTube channel as usual. So this will be available for playback later in case you need to hear something twice or you want to share with somebody else within your district. So, and then just one final reminder that you have been muted. So if we call on you, make sure to hit that unmute button. So first, just a couple of stats from the session. Total bills introduced this session compared to last session were up by about 100. We thought, given the pace that things were being introduced early on, that we were going to top 1,000. We didn't quite get there. We were pretty close. It felt like we had topped 1,000. Many of the bills were pretty repetitive. We had lots of duplicative topics. But we came in just under that 1,000 mark. Interestingly enough, the bills that we were tracking were down from last session by about 20, but I think that stat is a little bit disingenuous. Probably about 2 or 3 weeks in, we started getting pretty vicious when it came to cutting items that were on our tracking list. A lot of things that we typically would track where we might not necessarily weigh in on them, but we would track, had to get cut from our list early on because there were so many things that were pertinent to political subdivisions, education, etc. And so I think that stat is a little bit disingenuous, but nonetheless. Legislature did save 5 days, so they met for a technical 75 legislative days. Sine died at about 3 a.m. on the morning of Sunday, April 30th. You maybe recall some articles about the new colloquial term of fake days. A day doesn't count towards those constitutional days if they don't gavel in. So we had at least a half a dozen of those where we met and we're doing committee work, but they didn't gavel into floor session, and so they didn't count. So 75 legislative days, probably closer to 80, 82 actual working days, not including some of the weekend work. So top issues that we worked on this session. I'm going to dive right into funding and finance first, and of course, probably the bill that everybody paid closest attention to or asked the greatest number of questions about, waited to hear about most often, was Senate Bill 2284. And those of you that have been around for a while know that we do education funding in North Dakota. A little bit interesting in our legislature, we have 2 bills every session that handle that funding. We have the policy bill, which is 2284, that sets the per pupil rate. And then we have a second bill that actually includes the money. So we'll talk about the policy bill first. This is usually one of the last bills to come out, and it was probably, I think, in the last 5. We spent a Wednesday night until about 10:30 p.m. getting it wrapped up the last week of the session, and ended up including, I think, 22 or 23 sections of other policy changes, not just that per pupil payment setting. So these are the things that final bill did. Section 1 made some changes to your long-term planning process. If you recall your 3- and 5-year plans that you do, just some tweaks to what that includes, made it go from a shall to a may. I strongly recommend that you continue on as you have been conducting that planning process. You need that information for a lot of things. If we find that districts have stopped doing that, I can assure you that may will probably go back to a shall rather quickly. So section 2 was a clarification on what the probationary teacher language that we added in either a session or 2 ago meant. You may recall we've had some sessions on this in our negotiations seminars past. There was recently a Supreme Court case confirming that your probationary teacher status was within a district, not counting years outside of the district. This just added what the court ruling clarified and how we have been interpreting it. Sections 3 and 4 were at our request, basically codified how we have been handling possession of firearms and dangerous weapons by students in the building. The language was previously kind of unclear if you had to immediately suspend and expel a student for possessing a dangerous weapon. In addition to a firearm. We didn't believe that was the intent. We don't believe that's how you guys have been doing it. So we wanted to clarify that, and that's what those 2 do. Section 5 allows a school board to adopt a policy to permit private tutors on school premises, does not require you to do so, just allows you to do so if you so wish. Section 6 included language that increased the special education weighting factor. We went from a 0.082 to a 0.088. Also included an on-time funding increase to the 1.0 or a 0.7 for 23-24 school year. Section 7 kind of continued that language, went to the full 1.0 for the 24-25 school year. Section 8 was the small school weighting factor language that we had originally seen in Senate Bill 2328 before that got turned into a study. Those for the school districts that operate 2 plants 14 miles apart. Section 9 treats the school districts that operate elementary schools, basically does not give them the extra or the adjustment that they would get if they were simply an elementary district. There's very few of you, but if it is you and you want to talk through that, let me know. Section 10 includes that per pupil payment rate setting. We ended up with a 4% and a 4% increase. It is the second year of the biennium, just gets us over $11,000 per student for the first time. Language there also eliminates transition maximum adjustments. Section 7 increases the loan amount for school construction revolving loan fund. Also includes language that allows districts to use that fund to refinance loans, and increases the total amount of loans available, or the cap on the loans. Section 12 includes a study on the composition of the State Board of Public School Education. We have a few more studies in the upcoming sections: school choice model, teacher shortage and military family workforce, virtual instruction in lieu of storm days. Section 16 included a little bit of money for a transportation study through UND. Small organized schools is going to head that up. Section 17 included money for school lunches. You may recall House Bill 1491 dying. They did bring $6 million back to fund free school lunches for students that fall within the 130% to 200% of federal poverty level. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then sections 18 through 21 essentially appropriate turn back money from this last biennium back to DPI for a few different reading programs. And then Section 22 is a transfer from the SIF fund to the school construction revolving loan fund of $75 million for those increases that we talked about on the last slide. Okay, so now we're getting to the appropriations bill for school funding. That is Senate Bill 2013. This is, of course, DPI's budget, but it also includes the foundation aid appropriation that coincides with that per pupil payment. A couple of extra things to note in this bill. This bill does include that language that we've talked about a few times. It's not the first time we've seen it, but requires 70% of new money as a result of the base per pupil payment be used for non-administrative personnel compensation. Now, I believe one of the changes they made this year is that word compensation rather than salaries. The intent there is that 70% calculation includes, your insurance, your benefits, not just salary schedule. I think that's how we've been doing it, but they wanted to make sure that was extra clear. We also did some changes that special education tuition does not need to be deducted as in lieu of property tax, and included language to allow for extra funding of high cost students. Okay, before I move on from 2284 and 2013, I want to give anybody a chance to ask any specific questions there if they'd like. I'm only going to pause briefly, but okay. I don't see anything there. Okay. All right. Other funding or finance bills that passed. 1161, we made some changes for that 2% through school construction revolving loan fund. 1238 was, if you recall, last session, we managed to get a moratorium for the biennium on your ending fund balance restrictions. We did get that extended to 2027. There also is included in that bill a study on whether we need to continue that at all. I think there's some realization coming from legislators that perhaps we are having the opposite effect on property taxes and encouraging good spending with that limitation that we want to have. So hopefully we'll see that study pop up during the interim. House Bill 1245 just includes a requirement that you communicate with your taxpayers in dollars rather than mills when talking about property taxes and levies. Most of you do that already anyway. We'll probably issue a little bit of guidance and some examples on how to do that. But just make sure anytime you're talking about property taxes, if you're talking in mills, you also talk in dollars. Senate Bill 2180 increases the annual receipt amounts for political subdivisions who may submit an annual financial report to the state auditor in lieu of conducting a financial audit every 2 years. So what this means is that if you fall under that $2 million in receipts, you may not have to do an annual audit anymore. You just may need to file that financial report. I'm not sure how many of you fall into that category. I would guess not too many, but for what that's worth, you may want to look into that. And then Senate Bill 2328, that was originally the small school weighting factor bill. It is now just a study on school funding, technically creates a task force, brings in an outside nonpartisan entity. I think it's probably going to be Education Commission of the States to assist the legislature in doing a funding study during the interim. Okay, 1132 allows your, I moved, did I skip a slide? No, I didn't. Okay, moving on. Instruction and curriculum bills. 1132 allows military connected students, students with medical conditions, or students that move out of state to enroll early or remain enrolled in your district virtually. We have some questions here. Our understanding was that you didn't have to have a virtual academy. You could just allow them to remain enrolled virtually through the end of the end of the school year. We're seeing some stuff from DPI say that you have to have a virtual academy in order for this to apply to you. We need to do some checking here. I'm not quite sure what the answer is yet, but stay tuned for more information on that. 1156 requires a district to offer at least offer half-day kindergarten. You can use CDE in order to meet that requirement. 1231 requires dyslexia screening for children up to 7, I believe, and creates a task force. 1265 you probably read about in the newspaper. This is the bill that requires you to show a human growth and development video as part of your health curriculum. House Bill 1376, this is the virtual academy open enrollment. You no longer can restrict that based on a cost sharing agreement. That's no longer required. House Bill 1398, this is the bill that requires you to offer cybersecurity instruction, becomes a graduation requirement, I believe, starting in 2025. House Bill 1521, this bill included changes to what we call the Learn Everywhere program, essentially just eliminated some of the steps to get that program approved, simplified it a little bit. Now, once your local school board, your local entity approves it, you're good to go. We don't have to jump through as many hoops as before. Senate Bill 2028 is the interim assessment bill. This came out of the interim, requires you to offer at least 2 of those a year, includes the option to pay for your own or use the state-funded, state-selected assessment. And then Senate Bill 2254 is the bill that allows or grants DPI more authority over chronically low performing schools. Initially, this bill would have allowed DPI to close schools. We did manage to get that piece removed and add in some requirements that gives district a little bit more control over what the plan is to work with those schools. I'm hopeful that this version is better than the original, but we'll still have some work to do, and we'll need to continue to keep an eye on this one. Social issue bills. House Bill 1249, this is your transgender sports bill, requires you to designate athletic teams as male, female, or co-ed, and then prohibits males from participating in activities designated for females. This bill does essentially kind of follow the policy that the North Dakota High School Activities Association adopted not too long ago, so it should not be difficult for you to abide by this one. House Bill 1362, this is basically establishes a parent's interest in a child's upbringing as paramount. And then House Bill 1522, this one has been getting plenty of press time, prohibits a school district from adopting a policy regarding preferred gender pronouns, requires with parental consent a plan for the use of a separate restroom accommodation for a transgender student, and prohibits the use of any bathroom that does not coincide with the student's biological sex. Bills that affect your meetings. Just 2 of these this year. House Bill 1120 requires you to provide the opportunity to say the Pledge of Allegiance at the start of all of your meetings. And then House Bill 1270 requires that if requested, you record and make available the recordings of your meetings online. And actually, my slide is incorrect here. I have it listed as video recording, and that is not correct. It is simply recording. Audio recording would meet the requirements of the bill. Okay, I see a question there. What is the penalty, if any, for not following 1522? I'll get to that a little bit later. We're going to talk about policies a little bit later. There is no penalty within the bill, but that doesn't mean that there is not necessarily any penalty. So I'm going to leave that question in the box, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Paige is asking, Can someone request the full year to be recorded or just each meeting? And does the recording apply to board committees? So, Paige, the bill does not speak to the specifics of how a request be handled. My recommendation would be that if someone says, hey, I would like the full year to be recorded, treat that as a valid request. I think it's easy enough to do. It's not super difficult to record it in 2023. You've saved yourself the headache of waiting for their request to come in before every meeting. And then does the recording apply to board committees? Let me pull that up because I believe that we actually do speak to that. We don't speak to committees, but I think we call it regular meetings only. Regular or special meetings only. So the bill language specifically says regular or special meetings, so that would not apply to committee meetings. The only requirements on the request is that the request be submitted no later than 7 days prior to the meeting. So take that for what you will in regards to requesting a full year. Okay, and then I see somebody has their hand up. Cindy, did we answer your question? Cindy, do you have any further questions? All good. Okay. Okay. Okay, retirement bills. So House Bill 1040, we could spend an entire hour-long session on. Unfortunately, we are not going to do that today, or fortunately, depending on how excited you get about retirement benefits. The short of it is that House Bill 1040 closes the defined benefit plan in maybe 2024, maybe 2025 for new hires. There's a little bit of the original bill was 2025. Senate Bill 2015, which was the last bill out, included an amendment that allowed the PERS bill to say, hey, we're ready to go earlier and close that in 2024. There were some drafting errors in 2015. And so I'm not quite sure yet what effect, if any, that may have on that piece of 1040. So I have a meeting with some other political subdivisions, and Scott Miller, who runs the PERS plan currently, later this month. So we're hoping to get some better details and be able to share some full guidance with you, hopefully by June. So stay tuned for some more information on that. I think those details are kind of still playing out a little bit, hoping to see if they need to fix what was wrong in 2015, or if that's something that can be waited to deal with when they come back in 2025. We'll see. House Bill 1150, this is a TFFR bill. It exempts first-year teachers from paying the pension assessment in TFFR and gives them the option of being a member or not if the teacher served in armed forces for at least 20 years and retired with full military benefits before becoming a licensed teacher. So essentially, if you have a teacher who is a military veteran that is already receiving a pension, they can opt out of a second pension plan. And then 1219 changes TFFR benefits for teachers who return to work after having retired. So my understanding of how this works is essentially they get credit for the time that they are in the classroom after they come back from retiring. When they stop teaching again, their benefit gets recalculated. So our hope is that that will help us a little bit with the teacher shortage and entice some of those teachers that have retired but are maybe still thinking about it or still willing to come back and teach a little bit and boost their benefit. So. Okay, personnel. House Bill 1187, this one expands your ability to pay signing bonuses to licensed teachers new to your district or in a new role within the district. You may recall, if you have followed our delegate assembly, this came out of a resolution from the Fargo School District. 1193 expands the requirement to provide a leave of absence without loss of pay to employees for any military duty, including travel to and from a duty station. 1259 exempts from continuing contract rights any individual employed by a school district in a position substantially funded by grants, overloads, or a temporary funding source. So we kind of called this the short-term contract bill. Essentially, if you hire somebody knowing initially that this is going to be a short-term position, it's grant funded, that exempts the position from continuing contract rights. So we like that bill a lot. House Bill 1386, this is a great one too. It really allows local boards of school districts and administrators to have discretion over professional development content areas. So you recall that we have that minimum number of PD hours. In the past, we have had specific topics prescribed by the state. We now still have that list. We can choose from it if we so choose. We still have to meet the minimum required hours. But if there are topics that are more appropriate for our district, we have the ability to decide what works best or what is most needed in our district. So that's a great change. Senate Bill 2070, it extends those community expert teacher licenses, or allows you to extend your teachers licensed under that program for an additional 3 or 4 years, basically a maximum of 7 years, if the individual is enrolled in a teacher education program. So if you got them in under the initial licensure, they decided, hey, I kind of like this, I really want to become a teacher, they're in a program, you can extend their community expert license while they finish up their education to get a real license or a traditional license. And then Senate Bill 2380. This is, if you recall, we had some discussions during the superintendent sharing bill about the incentive to share a superintendent or a special ed director or a business manager. This makes a change that if you enter into that cooperative agreement, you only need to share one of those things in order to get a little bit of kickback of the state. It's an or now, not an and. You don't have to share two, you only need to share one of them and you get a slight kickback from the state. Okay, boards, campaigns, and elections. House Bill 1257. This is a new one for us as school board members. Previously, we have not had to file campaign finance statements. We do now if you are a candidate in a district with a fall enrollment of more than 1,000 students. So we will add, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we're going to work with Secretary of State's office to do some campaign finance training. I think we're going to start with our September Brunch and Learn, but we'll figure out a little bit what that looks like. You're going to file your report. When does 1257 go into effect? So it doesn't have an emergency clause, so it will go into effect on August 1st, but you'll follow the same campaign finance filing requirements that other candidates would file. So really our first sort of cycle is not going to be this set of June elections, it's going to be the next set of elections. And then Senate Bill 2223, this is really kind of only a Minot and a Grand Forks bill, but it does change the eligibility of who can serve on the school board of a military installation. This is effective now. It did have an emergency clause, was signed a month or so ago. Previously, you had to live on the military installation to serve on the board. That was kind of tough. We had a lot of empty seats. Now allows us to fill those seats with retired military members or active duty military members who live off base within a 15 or 20 mile radius. I don't quite remember of the base. So I'm hopeful that that bill will allow us to get some folks into those positions and create some stability on those boards. So excited to hear from the Minot and Grand Forks folks how that works. Okay, looking at questions here. So we have a recall election on August 13th. Contributions are received prior to the August 1st deadline. You know what? Anonymous, get with me on that afterwards. We're going to have to dive in a little bit there. I am not familiar enough with the campaign finance reporting deadlines to tell you how that's going to work today, but we'll dive into that a little bit later. Okay, lunch bills. I told you we'd talk about this later. So House Bill 1494, this was the lunch shaming bill, no lunch shaming bill. Essentially, you cannot any longer have a policy that gives a child a different meal if they're behind on their lunch bills. You know, basically stigmatizes the child in any way. We were able to retain the ability for you to send those bills to collections. We felt that that was important, not that we do that often, not that you get a lot of money back, but we felt that it was an important tool to make sure that everybody didn't just stop paying their lunch bill, because why not? And then, as I mentioned earlier, in Senate Bill 2284, there is $6 million for students between essentially 130 and 200% of the federal poverty level lunches in public and non-public schools. So why 130 and 200? Essentially, right, the federal free and reduced program covers students up to 130% of the federal poverty level. So this 6 million covers students up to 200%. So essentially, we'll use the federal dollars first, and then the state dollars will cover the gap between 130 and 200. You do have to be participating in the federal program, and people do have to fill out the form in order to receive the benefits. So please encourage your folks. I know you already are, but encourage your folks to fill out those forms. All right. Couple of questions here. Are texts sent via PowerSchool about negative lunch balances still going to be allowed? I don't know the answer to that question because I don't know enough about PowerSchool texts. I'm assuming they go straight to the parent, not the child, in which case I believe they would be allowed. If that assumption is incorrect, then I'm not sure. Basically, what the bill prohibits is anything that would single out the child in front of their peers, right? Like you couldn't put a sticker on the kid's hand that says my lunch balance is late as a way of notifying the parent, because that would identify the kid in front of their peers. If it's a text message straight to the parent that, you know, the kid's peers can't see, that would be allowed. And then will NDSBA be coming out with an updated policy for lunches? We'll talk about those in a little bit. Okay, so I said we'll talk about policies in a little bit. Here we are. There were a lot of bills this session that are going to require policy tweaks. Last session, we had some bills that required brand new policies. We don't really have any of those this session, but there are, like I said, quite a few tweaks. So a few of those, I don't have lunches on my list, but we're still going through all of those. So we will add that as one to take a look at. Other ones on our list are virtual instruction, of course, that Learn Everywhere policy, exercise of religion, meeting procedures, professional development. Oh, I do have school meals on my list. See, I'm not even sure what's on my list. There's so many. So there's your answer. Yes. Audit requirements. We talked a little bit about that one, 2180 or 2180. There was another bill, 1508, that put in a couple of different requirements for the auditor on what he or that office needs to provide to you when they're doing an audit. So one of those things being an itemized bill. So we'll need to take a look at that policy and just make sure that none of those things are affected there as well. Disclosure of student records. We didn't talk about that bill today, but basically it involves disclosing student records to DHS when they're doing a child abuse or neglect investigation, unless prohibited by FERPA. Weapons policies, we talked about in 2284, those changes. And then 1522, I put you off on this question earlier. All of our policy services members got an email earlier this week, basically recommending that if you have adopted our policy FDI or a similar policy, recommending that you rescind it. That policy would likely violate the law with 1522. As I said earlier, 1522 does not have a penalty in it, but it does speak. Let me pull it up to make sure that I am speaking 100% correctly here. Yeah, so it doesn't include a specific penalty, but it does include a claim of action, basically saying an individual may assert a violation of this section as a claim or defense in a judicial proceeding and is entitled to recover appropriate relief, including reasonable attorney fees and court costs. So, you know, I'm not an attorney. I don't know how meaningful those things always are. In my world, the repercussions are more likely to be the legislative bills that come next session, if that makes sense. The things that we see legislators do, the funding changes that they make, things like that, versus things that happen in a court. So all of that to say, there's no hard penalty described in law, but that doesn't mean that there is no penalty. So what I would tell you to do is if that is a question for your district, I would encourage you to reach out to your own legal counsel and have that conversation. Okay. All right. In addition to policy changes, there are quite a few things that we're going to be needing to issue some guidance on in the next month or two. Most of this is probably going to be coming before that August 1 date. All bills, unless they have a specifically defined effective date or an emergency clause, the presumed effective date is August 1. So here's just kind of a list of those things. Some of them will have their own very specific guidance. Some of them will just come out in a shorter general guidance document. But keep an eye out for these, and we'll have an article in the bulletin this month as well that will include this list of items. Okay, and my favorite slide every legislative session is what I call the bill graveyard, because I think that getting good things passed is great, but quite often the more important work is getting rid of bad things or stopping bad ideas. That would harder than it's ever been this session. And it felt, it was difficult. I'll just say that it was difficult, particularly when there were a lot of really duplicative bills. If any of you were debate club members, it's tough when you use all your best arguments to kill the first bill, and now you got to come back and kill it 2 more times when everybody's already heard your best stuff. So a couple of the things that we were able to kill, number of things that were different budget limiters or referral of your budget. Book bans, of course, you all read about those in the newspaper. Property tax limitations and prohibitions. There actually was a concurrent resolution that would have put elimination of all property taxes on the ballot in June. That was a fun one. Dangerous weapons bills, one of my favorites, and I say that loosely, was a bill that would have required you to dedicate 15% of your general fund to school safety measures unless you allowed people to conceal and carry on district property. Different bond threshold bills, one in particular would have required a approval of, I believe it was 60% of all eligible voters in the district, and not just those that showed up. That was an interesting discussion on how you were going to figure out how many eligible voters there were when we don't have voter registration. Of course, 2260, thank you to you guys who all sent emails. That was a nice win to get towards the end of the session to kill that bill. Superintendent sharing 1251, that was a great effort as well earlier in the session. And then the voucher bill, I think, or I know we're going to see that conversation continue down the road. We'll see how that continues. And then, the other thing that I would add to that discussion is that we can't forget many of the bills that started out probably as bills I would have liked to kill, but through lots and lots of work became okay bills. So just because we didn't kill it didn't mean that a bad idea didn't become tolerable or an okay thing. And so, I limit it to one slide, but the reality is the bulk of the work that we do throughout the session is kind of in this area, trying to make sure that we do no harm, or as little harm as we possibly can. That was, as I said, that was a challenge this session. But I think we got some wins at the end that we were grateful for. So what's next? I told you that we would talk a little bit about the interim. The first thing that I typically talk about for interims is administrative rule writing. We have a few bills that require administrative rule writing this session. The appointment of military school board members, school district cooperative agreements, those Learn Everywhere updates, and interim assessments. Typically, the way the rule writing process works, you can see that on your screen. Typically, we would be at a point now where a committee would be being formed to draft rules. A lot of times committees involve folks like us, folks like the Superintendent's Association or NDU. You put all the heads together and work on rules. All of our topics this session were actually simple enough that DPI has been able to make all of the changes already to the rules without having to put together big, robust committees. And so the public comment period has already begun for these. And the public hearing has been scheduled for June 8th. So we are quite a bit ahead of where we typically are in the process most legislative sessions. So if you are interested in any of these, they're posted on DPI's website. The deadline for public comments is June 19th. The public hearing is June 8th here in Bismarck. Once that public comment period deadline passes, they'll make any revisions that they need to based on comments. Then it will have to go, all of the rule changes will go in front of the Administrative Rules Committee for final approval. And then once they get that stamp of approval, they'll officially be effective. Typically, we end up looking at January, so almost a year out, but I think we're probably closer to maybe August for that with this batch of rules. Other things for the interim studies. There were a lot of studies on our list this session. You know, we kind of joke death by study a lot of times. If you want to kill something without actually killing it, turn it into a study. We'll see how many studies will get selected this session. Legislative management is meeting on May 25th to select studies. Studies can be done by the interim committees of legislators, by task forces that legislative management appoints or hired. Kind of, we talked about Education Commission of the States doing that finance study, or other groups made up of kind of a mix of individuals. You might recall we started a finance study in the interim before COVID happened, and that task force included some superintendents and business managers and legislators. So it was kind of a mix. These studies can result in legislation, but they don't have to. Sometimes they're just information gathering. If they do result in legislation, if the bill is going to be proposed by an interim committee at the next legislative session, it has to be read at 2 meetings of the interim committee. So I have a link there for the webpage for this next interim. This is where we'll find our interim committees, the study assignments, all of that once they're selected. The page is there. There's not a lot of information yet. So one of the things, you know, Legislative Council was pretty new this year. They had a lot of brand new attorneys. They worked really hard this session, just like we all did. And I think they're all taking some well-deserved time off. So we're going to send out a final legislative update later this afternoon. We have linked to all of the, I want to say all of the final versions of the bills that we can, but know that the website really hasn't been updated since they adjourned sine die on April 30th. So not all of the information on the website is current, and that includes this interim page. So the link is there. Our links and our update will be there, but if you're looking for something specific and it doesn't seem quite right, keep checking back. They'll get it updated. They're just taking a little break too. So some potential studies to watch for that we've kind of talked about already: school choice models, public school funding formula. I believe that was a shall study, meaning it must be chosen. School transportation funding, that was the one that included the appropriation that small organized schools and UND, I think, are going to take the lead on. Virtual instruction, I believe that was shall consider, so it may not be selected. Teacher shortage, composition of the state board, North Dakota High School Activities Association, and spectator conduct are just a few on the list. And then these are, you know, when we did this last session, we did it a month later and we knew who our committees were. If you've been a board member or superintendent for a while, you know that our legislative committees, our House Ed and our Senate Ed committees, were very fresh this session. We had a lot of newbies. And I think we're going to see the same with our interim committees. So last interim, we had an education policy committee and an education funding committee. We may see that same structure again this session. We may not. We may go back to one education interim committee. It's hard to say what new leadership will do. We have a new chair of legislative management. They may look to shake things up a little bit again. But everybody that I have redlined here is no longer a legislator. So especially if we look at our education funding committee, right, 50% of those members are no longer there. We do better in education policy, but I think we'll see quite a few new members here. It will be interesting to see. I'm hopeful perhaps that we keep this two committee structure, if only because I think the funding study is going to be a very heavy lift. And you all know how complicated our funding formula is, and particularly with term limits coming up, we really need to spend some time educating on how that funding formula works. And if we can identify another core group of folks to learn, know, understand that formula, that's only going to benefit us and help us down the road. And so I would like to see that education funding committee separate from the policy committee again, just so we can get some more folks to really dive in again. I believe Senator David Rust has told some folks he doesn't plan to come back again next session. So that would, he'll be here for the interim, but that would put us another individual down who understands the formula. I think it's going to be important now more than ever, given particularly term limits and sort of public perception of public education, that we continue to educate the best that we can with every single legislator, particularly those serving on our education committees. And the interim is absolutely where we need to start, and our best opportunity to really double down on that work. And so I would encourage you all to follow the interim committee work as close as you can, certainly closer than you maybe have them in the past, and begin building those relationships during the interim committee work. What else? Here's my big question of the week, and kind of what I'm snooping around on this week. We all know that the governor issued some vetoes during session, but what happens when the legislature adjourns and there's still bills to sign? The governor has worked his way through the pile of bills that the legislators left when they left town. He did issue 3 line item vetoes in Senate Bill 2015 after they left town. They do have the ability to attempt to override those vetoes if they wish. But in order to do that, they have to call themselves back into session and use some of those 5 days that they saved. Now, they have no time limit to call themselves back to do that, other than any potential effective dates of that legislation, right? Like there's not, constitutionally, they don't have X number of days to decide. But if there were an effective date on one of those items, that might influence the timeline that they decide whether or not they're going to call themselves back to attempt to override. However, here's the fun part, and I say that very loosely. Should they decide to call themselves back, once they're back, they can take up any additional issue they choose. They are not limited to just a veto override. Now, I haven't heard any gossip that indicates they plan on bringing themselves back. Like I mentioned, legislative management is meeting on May 25th. So we'll probably be snooping around next week to see if we can hear any chatter. One kind of interesting little tidbit is that in the 2021 special session, they appropriated some money for some renovation of the House and Senate chambers, which includes painting the ceiling, new carpets. I don't think they've gotten new chairs in 25 years, whatever, things like that. The scaffolding has already gone up. So if they were to call themselves back, at least the House chamber, I'm not sure about the Senate, but the House chamber, the desks are completely, draped in covering, and scaffolding covers the whole chamber all the way up to the ceiling. So if they were to call themselves back anytime soon, I'm not quite sure where they would meet. They probably, I believe the rules allow them to meet virtually like they did during COVID, but it's an interesting question. So we'll be watching. I have a feeling that given some of the discussions in recent weeks, if they were to come back, there probably would be some public education related discussions, but we'll see. Stay tuned. Okay, so I just gave you my pitch for participating during the interim. How do you do that? So before I do that, I want to issue a huge thank you to my legislative committee. These folks got on a call with Amy and I every Friday at 3 o'clock. What a great way to spend happy hour on Friday, right? To talk through all of the issues and all of the bills that came up and really give us kind of the on the ground perspective. And we could not have survived session without them. So please, if you know these folks, send them a thank you. We really appreciate the work that they did and them sharing their knowledge and expertise. If you are interested in serving on that committee next session, let us know. I'll usually start soliciting those folks probably the July, August prior. But we also have a government affairs committee, and that government affairs committee works on our standing resolutions that help shape our legislative advocacy work. This committee meets every year. It is a 1 or 2 meeting committee. I start soliciting applications in July. The work is, like I said, 1 or 2 meetings, conference calls that leads up to our delegate assembly in October. So if you're interested in kind of getting a taste of advocacy work, but not quite ready to commit to those Fridays at 3 p.m. for 4 months committee, the Government Affairs Committee is a great place to start. So watch the bulletin, watch your email. Like I said, we'll start soliciting interest in that committee in July. And then really, I'm just looking for folks to try to stay in the know. Please watch your bulletin, watch your emails, watch the webinar schedule. We'll be covering the topics that the legislature is covering. NDSBA convention will be diving into some of these topics that have come out of the legislative session in greater detail. Follow those interim committees, just like during the legislature. All of the committee meetings will be broadcast online. Their agendas will be there. Their slides will be linked. It all will be available there for viewing live or at a later date. And then please, this is most important, connect with your legislators. You guys know this session probably more than any other session. I really asked you to reach out to your local legislators. That is so much more effective when you have developed a relationship with them prior to the start of session, so they recognize your name when it pops up in their email inbox because they've talked to you already. Now is a great time to begin that conversation. Many districts are working on their reorganization within their local parties. If you are someone that identifies whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, attend those things, participate in those things. I know partisan politics isn't always fun, but that is one way that we can support those legislators that we call on to support us when it comes to legislative session. It's good for them to know that we are their constituents, and that we've been there in the trenches with them as well. So with that, we have just a couple minutes left. I tried to talk as fast as I could. I will take a couple of questions if there are any. Like I said, if you have any specific questions, I know there was one, you were anonymous, but we wanted to talk about campaign finance later, send me an email. You can see our contact information here. But otherwise, if there's 1 or 2 questions now, I would sure take those. Okay, I'm not seeing any. So it's going to kind of be my last call. Okay, well, with that, I will say thank you for joining us today. We sure appreciate you spending your morning with us. I appreciate all of your assistance during legislative session. Remember that this recording and the slides will be available at ndsba.org under the resources tab. And of course, the recording is available on our YouTube channel. If you're a regular attendee, please stay tuned and watch for our email. We've got some great topics coming up the rest of the year. Grand Forks will be presenting on their Mentor Center in June. We have a brief break break in July. Enjoy your summer. An update from TFFR in August, and then, as I mentioned, a campaign finance training in September. So watch your email for more details on those topics in the coming weeks. Registration, of course, is available on the NDSBA website. And again, thank you. We certainly appreciate your participation and your support. Give us a call at the office or shoot me an email if you have any questions. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.